Why might not, in like manner, several parties, though it be supposed they perfectly remember the words delivered by Peter in a sermon 20 years before, which I would not grant, but that it is a work of charity to help the weak, what hinders but that they may understand them in contrary senses, and so derive from them contrary conclusions, and yet both pretend to assert nothing but the doctrine delivered from St. Peter's mouth? Are there not sharp contests amongst popish authors about the opinion of the Council of Trent in diverse points, and that too among those who were present upon the place, and heard their debates? And will these men still undertake to prove that snow is black, or, which is equivalent to it, that it was impossible to do that which is usually done, that is, to mistake the doctrines of the former age? Let us consider one scripture instance. St. Paul tells us, "A man is justified by faith without the works of the law," and that Abraham was thus justified. The papists remember the words, but mistake the sense. Now put case, St. Paul had preached the same words, as he did unquestionably the same things, which he wrought. Who can say that hath any care what he saith, that they that mistook the sense of those words when they read them in a book, could not as easily have mistaken them when they heard them from his mouth? Especially if it be considered that St. James preached and wrote a doctrine in words seemingly contrary to these. My question now is, what should hinder that the several hearers of those apostles, perfectly remembering their various expressions, might not derive contrary traditions from them? Why might not the one side have apprehended Paul as excluding all works in the Protestant sense from justification, and the others have understood James, as the papists at this day do, as conjoining faith and works in justification? And if this cannot be denied, then it follows unavoidably that errors may come into the Church under pretense of tradition, which was the thing to be proved. Another instance we have in the Sadducees, whose error is reported to have come into the world under the color of tradition, when Antigonus Sochaeus, a master in Israel, was teaching that if there was no future reward, no immortality of the soul, no resurrection of the body, yet we ought to serve God. His scholar, Sadok, so misunderstood him that he broached a new doctrine, and turned his hypothetical proposition into a categorical, and asserted that there was no resurrection of the body, nor immortality of the soul. And will these men pawn their souls on it, that it was impossible for the apostles' hearers to commit the same mistakes in the doctrines they heard from their mouths? Hath not St. John given us an instance of easiness and earliness of such mistakes in John 21, where, upon that expression of Christ concerning John, "If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee?" the evangelist observes that a tradition was delivered among the brethren, that the disciples should not die, verses 22 and 23. In a word, if it be so familiar a thing, as daily experience shows, for common hearts to misunderstand the words and mistake the sense of a preacher, when they are but newly come from him, and all things are fresh in their memory, what a desperate assertion is this! That a man can certainly remember the words and infallibly understand the sense of those sermons he heard from his former ministers, it may be 20 years ago. And if it be granted, as it cannot be denied, that the hearers of the second age might mistake the doctrines delivered by the teachers of the foregoing age in some things, why might not the hearers of the third age mistake their predecessors in other things, and so in the fourth, and further, until at last the system of divinity came to the ruthful habit in which it is delivered in the Church of Rome? To clear this further, consider what I have already intimated. Section 15, number 3. The words of our predecessors may be remembered, and yet the sense wonderfully perverted. Now, as it is not words, but the sense of them wherein the soul lies, so all or most of the controversies in the Church are about the sense of words. And in this, Scripture and tradition are equally liable to the same fate. The words may be agreed, and the controversy arise solely about the sense of them. For example, the tradition of the first age was this: that God alone was to be worshipped, not men, not angels, not images. Nor is it possible that any man should express his mind more plainly and positively than the Fathers unanimously did in this particular. Now comes the next age, and they receive indeed this tradition. But then here ariseth the question: in what sense, they said, God alone was to be worshipped? St. Austin takes it up and saith, they meant that God alone was to be worshipped with latria, and the saints with dulia. And although it is evident enough that by dulia St. Austin meant nothing but a civil worship, because he ascribes it to the living as well as the dead, and when he takes dulia for a religious worship, he appropriates it to God, yet this unhappy distinction falling into the hands of his perverse successors gave rise to another controversy. That is, in what sense St. Austin describes dulia to the creature. And thus, as in the throwing of a stone upon the water, one circle begets another, so doth one controversy engender another, and another of them is a convincing evidence of the fallibility of tradition. Take one instance more. St. Gregory, the great Pope, delivers this doctrine to posterity as his doctrine and the doctrine of his ancestors, that whosoever calls himself universal bishop is proud, profane, abominable, wicked, blasphemous, and the forerunner to Antichrist. This is confessed. Now, Gregory's successors have an itch after the name and thing of universal bishop. In order to this, they start a question, where indeed there was none to men that had either science or conscience. That is, in what sense Gregory condemned this title of universal bishop. For this is a maxim: let the Pope speak what words he please, the sense is always orthodox. Oh, say these Sophi, John of Constantinople called himself a universal bishop, as if he were the only bishop, and all others but his vicars, and that they must not so much as have the name of bishop, a sense that poor John never dreamed of, nor any man of that age, for then surely Anastasius, the patriarch of Antioch, and Mauritius, the emperor, would never have written to Gregory as they did, that it was but a frivolous thing that John desired. For now, by this ingenious device, here comes in a new, contrary, and that too, forsooth, a Catholic tradition, that is, that the Pope is, and ever ought to be, and ever was, universal bishop. But whether the popish gloss be sound or rotten, it equally serves my purpose, which is to show how controversies may arise about the sense and errors come in at that door, through tradition, though tradition, hath made a report of the words, which it seldom doth. I might multiply instances, but these will suffice for a candid adversary, and others nothing will suffice.